evening. This is Crash Talk. I'm Mike Harber, your host. Thank you for joining us this evening for this episode. This is kind of a little bit of an eye-opener on some of the background on one of the biggest topics that we have that I'm questioned about routinely, diminished value. People always want to know, what is diminished value? Is it real? I don't think my car is going to be worth as much. I know I'm going to get killed when I take it in to trade it in to get another vehicle. So people always want to know about diminished value. Well, there are a group of attorneys that really help to seal the deal for the consumers in the state of Washington. Those attorneys hung in there for almost 15 years to get the Supreme Court to render the decision in the case, the landmark case called Moeller versus Farmers. David Moeller was an insured with Farmers Insurance and had a pretty serious accident, wanted to make a claim for his diminished value against farmers. Now, this was a case back then where it was his insurance and it was his fault. And interestingly enough, after this case had been filed, almost all of the insurance companies have now put exclusions in their policy where they don't pay diminished value on claims if it's your fault and you're making a claim against your insurance company. It doesn't really change the fact if someone else damages your property or if it's an uninsured motorist claim. But this case really established that there is ongoing damage, that a vehicle has never been fully restored to its pre-loss condition in most cases. So the local attorney who was responsible for the case in our state is with us tonight. And we're going to talk a little bit about the background and what took place during this case. And so with that, let me give my disclaimer. I, Mike Harber, any of my employees of CrashTalk or Harber Appraisal, we will not be giving you legal advice. We're not attorneys. But Steve is, and he is a local attorney in our state and represents consumers in personal injury claims, has many times represented consumers in diminished value cases, total losses, and other insurance-related type claims. So with that, let's go ahead and turn to Steve and hear a little bit about the background and some of the things that help to establish diminished value as an element of a loss. Steve, thank you so much for just joining us this evening. A couple of things. Well, you are the go-to guy in the state of Washington on issues that have to do with, especially with property damage, diminished value. And I want to say, for the consumers of the state of Washington, thank you for you and your team and the efforts that you've put out for us. I mean, specifically in the Moeller versus Farmers case, which is the latest latest diminished value case we have from the Supreme Court. You and your group hung in there for 14 years, and that took. Well, I need to be politically correct, but that took a lot of energy and a lot of finances in order to hang in there and get the decision that benefits consumers in this state. So thank you very much.
Well, you're welcome. You were a part of that team, Mike, because you served as an expert witness. You did a lot of groundwork when the work was being done, how to make the determination how we value damages for these vehicles on a class-wide basis. We had Deborah Hayes from Houston and Scott Neely they're fantastic attorneys. And then Ken Masters, who did the appellate oral argument for us. And so it was a team effort. But it took a long time, which in some respects was serendipitous when it comes to the issues of diminished value, simply because by the time the case got to trial, some of these vehicles that had been damaged and had been damaged, wrecked and repaired, were so old that we were able to see, and you did the work on that, we were able to see how these cars aged so terribly. They came off, they came out of the body shop, and like the insurance company would say, or even the body shop owner would say, "Hey, looks great." The consumer, if there's been a good job done on it, the consumer's going to say, "Hey, this looks great." And then what did we find? 10 years, it literally was 10 years, hurry up and wait. 10 years down the road, no pun intended, we started looking at some of these vehicles that were still owned by the insureds, and the parts that had been painted, damaged and painted, they had all the rock chips, where the parts that had not been damaged and had the original paint looked pretty darn good. Or we saw where all the clear coat was starting to, cloud or even peel off. And that was just on the outside. If you got up underneath and started looking and, looking at all the rust or rust where the vehicles had not been rust proofed like they do in a factory, or they done improper welds or that sort of thing. It was what the insurance company wanted to be used in support of their case really became the poster children for our case, and why the market values cars that have been wrecked and repaired less than a comparable vehicle.
Yeah, well, and what you're referring to, and just for our listeners to understand, is that during the process of that case, and correct me if I'm wrong, but as I recall, and it was a few years ago.
Yeah, it was.
But Farmers Insurance then went out and they wanted to show the court that there really wasn't a difference, and so that they actually went out and cherry picked. I think it started out with 12, but 2 of those vehicles had since been, I think, in another accident and totaled. So we ended up with 10 vehicles.
Right. They originally wanted. They asked the judge for permission to go find 100 vehicles. The judge didn't want that, and so they narrowed it down to that number.
I didn't realize they wanted 100. So what they were just trying to do is labor everybody to death, right?
Whatever their strategy was, they didn't. A defense strategy is always to try to confuse and throw mud at the wall. So I can't speak for the attorneys, but it started out as 100, got down to 10, and again, it as you know, it proved our case.
Well, and what was interesting about it is that we went out really not knowing what we were going to find. I mean, we made contact with the people. We set up a time to have it inspected in a facility where we had good lighting and we could put them on a lift. The experts for Farmers participated, and so we were all present at the same time when we went over these. And I have quite a volume of photographs and documents from each one of those, and without exception, every vehicle we looked at, it was clearly evident where the areas were repaired, and none of it was substandard work. I mean, you couldn't go back and say, well, if the shop had just done a better job.
Right.
It's simply the fact that you can't do the same processes that they do in a factory. You can't dip the cars. They're not completely stripped down. They're not painted at 400 degrees. And so all of those factors are what led to, like you just said, the evidence of where the repair took place, either chipping or peeling or rust or any number of things.
I wish we had the ability to show some of those photographs, because they are your description, which is 100% accurate, doesn't do justice to the stark contrast.
Right.
looking at fender on the driver's side that wasn't damaged, or the quarter panel, and the quarter panel on the passenger side that was damaged, and just seeing the differences.
Yeah. Well, who was the PhD on that? What was his name?
Chris Woods.
Chris Woods.
He was retained to show and to discuss secondary damage, and then how the forces of impact transfer through the car.
Right.
And so the crush site where the impact was would not necessarily, well, certainly would be part of where the damage was, but his testimony demonstrated how really the shock wave could damage things all over the vehicle.
Sure.
And of course, you found that out. We purchased one of the class member plaintiff's vehicles, and it was a Toyota 4Runner, right?
Yes.
And it had the nicest people in the world. They were taking the vehicle up to Crystal Mountain to go skiing, and anybody who's driven up there knows that there's a lot of deer and elk, and they ran across the road and the vehicle rolled. And it was a brand new vehicle, and it was repaired for a lot of money. But again, 10, 12 years after the fact, they were still driving the vehicle. We purchased it, and you guys disassembled it. And what did you find?
Well, why I'm laughing, I still have that vehicle.
Is it drivable, Mike?
Well, that's part of the problem. That's part of the problem, because we were maintaining this as evidence in case it was going to be needed in future cases, because it was so it was such a stark depiction of what happens, because the amount of work that it took in order to disassemble this vehicle. I mean, we completely took this vehicle apart to where you could see all of the inner structure. And it was exactly what Dr. Woods had said. We found buckling and just a lot of bad remaining damage that was not even in the area of repair, but it was all affected from that shock that goes through a vehicle when it's damaged.
Well, you found a lot of rust where the vehicle was leaking too, right?
Exactly.
Things didn't fit properly.
Right. Yeah, I was actually wondering if the Trial Lawyers Association would want to have that vehicle as a memorial to the Supreme Court decision.
Hey, as long as we're on YouTube, if there's anybody out there who wants to own a piece of history,
a piece of history.
Yeah, you can send your cards and letters into Mike.
I drove that vehicle into my barn 8 years ago, 7 years ago. I drove it.
Yeah.
And everything that we disassembled, we put enough together to where it was road legal to drive it. But the interior and everything was all boxed and labeled and it's all very nicely stacked up on the inside of the vehicle. But it's been it's been sitting in my barn now for, I want to say at least 8 years. So
as a memorial to a precedent-setting case.
Another good evening here at Crash Talk, and I want to thank Steve. I want to thank Steve and all of his associates that helped make this a reality in our state, to help consumers establish the fact that diminished value is real. Really laid the groundwork for other cases that are going forward even as we speak. If you have questions about diminished value, we at Harber Appraisal, we review no charge. So we'll review your claim. We'll give you an idea of what your claim is worth, so you can decide if you want to pursue that and assert your rights, recover what's owed to you. If your vehicle's gone down in value, you certainly want to be reimbursed for that loss in value. But it's also, I find it really interesting, all of the background that took place. with Dr. Woods, and how he was able to show how there is secondary damage. Now, we're not talking about minor little impacts, but when it's a serious accident, it's just like if you were to drop your computer, your laptop, drop it on the floor. All of those little electrical connections are affected by that impact. The same thing happens in an automobile. Think of how many computers are built into the vehicles nowadays. Every one of those little electrical connections, seams within the structure of the vehicle, are all affected by that impact. That's why you can end up with these water leaks. And if you have an interest in a forerunner as a memorial to the Supreme Court decision, I can make it available at a very reasonable price. Anyway, it's been a pleasure being with you tonight, and hope to see you same time, same place next week. This has been Crash Talk.